It's another edition of the West of the Rest podcast alongside 24/7 Sports national recruiting editor Brandon Huffman. I am Blair Angulo and Huff. This used to be a beautiful day. We were usually on the edge of our seats, maybe running on very little sleep, already kind of pre-loading our Starbucks orders for those 5 a.m. Starbucks drive-through runs. It's the eve of February National Signing Day, and the excitement is gone. And obviously, the entire recruiting calendar has shifted, and now it's the early signing period. But kind of reminiscing on that first February or first Wednesday of February brings back some good memories.
You had fax machines, and for you young people, fax machines were the wave of the future. Before there was eFax, before there was DocuSign, we had fax machines. We had letters of intent, national letters of intent. NLI was prevalent before NIL. Big festivals, parties. Guys didn't enroll early. Guys announced their commitments to that school in the winter of their senior year. They would pull dogs from underneath the table. They would put on houndstooth hats. They would have their mom take their NLI and disappear before they had a chance to fax it to said school. We used to have so much drama on that first Wednesday. I remember one of my all-time favorite days was the signing day of 2011, when the rumors had started to percolate that DeAnthony Thomas was going to Oregon. He had been on an official visit to Oregon, and somebody saw him at the airport. And in that evening, he hadn't publicly signed anywhere yet. And I get to Crenshaw High School. He's set to make his official announcement, and there's a cake in the back of the Crenshaw gym with Oregon helmets on it. And he comes out decked out in all Oregon gear. I mean, those were the good old days. And what I really liked about it too is the Super Bowl would be like 4 days afterwards. So there would just be such this mad rush to get to that Wednesday that you had like 3 or 4 days to recover, and you can just chill and watch the Super Bowl in peace. God, those are the good old days, Blair.
Yeah, and then obviously that first Thursday of February was National Unfollow Day on social media, which was an entirely different holiday. Not a lot to dive into. I know obviously a lot of the classes have been buttoned up and sealed up since the early signing period. Then you had the transfer portal window, which allowed them to supplement some voids or some empty spots in certain rosters or depth charts. But there is one player that's a 4-star out west that is still unsigned, still uncommitted, at least publicly, and that's Anthony Jones, the 4-star defensive lineman from Irvine. He plays at Crean Lutheran, a player that was originally committed to UCLA. Kind of was deciding between UCLA, Tennessee, Washington throughout his process. Ends up committing to the Bruins. The coaching change and everything that was happening there in Westwood, in a way, kind of forced him to reopen his process. He, I think, started to kind of look around and get a feel for other programs. Didn't sign early, and now has taken an official visit to Oregon this past weekend. So the Ducks appear to be in a good spot there. And, when you think about the positional need of them trying to fill some spots there along the defensive line, I think would be an intriguing addition, because I think from a physical standpoint, this is a player who started out, remember, Huff, as an edge rusher in our rankings and has continued to bulk up, has continued to kind of add some mass, and is now viewed as a true defensive tackle, maybe a 3-tech. And I think what's interesting about him is that background as an edge rusher and his multi-sport in a way profile has allowed him to be a really intriguing, high upside, projectable victory for whoever lands him. Like I said, it looks like the Ducks will be on the receiving end there, and I think there is a lot of upside there.
And what's interesting is, remember, there was a time during the spring where there was even some speculation, some talk from his own coaches that maybe he was best suited to be an interior offensive lineman. And, we've seen players that have made that move from the defensive line to the offensive line, and it worked out famously for them. We've seen guys that maybe outgrew the edge position, move inside. They still had that quickness. So it is an intriguing pickup. And, there was a time back in the day where you didn't have guys that were announcing on signing day unless they were a big time guy. Now it's almost like was there something wrong when he didn't sign in December? Obviously, the coaching change at UCLA kind of wreaked havoc on that. Remember, he took an official visit to Arizona State the weekend before the original signing day in December. So kind of a much traveled recruitment and also a much traveled position, but could be some intriguing upside to whoever lands him on Wednesday.
Yeah, so the Oregon Ducks get that last official visit. We'll see kind of what happens. We had also heard maybe some San Diego State buzz for him earlier in the recruiting process. So a lot to decipher here for Anthony Jones here in the next, 24 hours or so. Huff, we're also going to dive into some junior days. We're going to discuss some commitments. We had a run of commitments over the weekend. Where do you want to begin? Because the junior days were really impressive when you think about some of the visitor lists at Arizona State, at Cal, at Oregon, the 2 Los Angeles schools, even some of the Pac-12 schools from across the West region had some visitors on campus ahead of what we are now in a dead period throughout the month of February. The quiet period begins March 3rd, I believe, or March 2nd. So we're about a month away from recruits being able to go back on college campuses in a quiet period. And, it kind of set the table for what's going to be now a lull of sorts. A lot of communication still, but I think everyone was trying to squeeze in these last visits so they could be fresh on the mind heading into the official visits.
Yeah, and guys were busy because they didn't want to miss a junior day at one school that they felt like they were a priority, but they also wanted to go take one last peek at another school. So you had schools that were hosting the junior day on Saturday, but then they had some unofficial visits on Friday. They had some unofficial visits on Sunday. In the meantime, you also had a couple of major events this weekend. You had Pylon in Los Angeles. You had Red Zone in Arizona. You had the Giant Skills Showcase in Southern California, which brought some guys from outside the region to some of these West Coast schools. So these coaches that have just been, really pelotas to the wall for the last month with the transfer portal, with getting out on the road. We had heard from schools that a coach would be in one state in the morning and then you would see him at a showcase that afternoon in another state. So these coaches, they were running rampant through the month of January with the portal, with recruiting, and a few junior days were had. A couple other schools just kind of hosted mini meet and greet days with kind of some of their top targets. As you broke the news last week, Cal got the number 1 player in the state of California for the 2027 class, with honor, followed by Ed Johnson going up to Berkeley. The Bears also got the number 2 player in the entire country in the 2028 class, Jelani George, the number 1 defensive prospect in the class, going up to Berkeley. So the Bears, Tosh Lupoi having his first major event. They had guys on campus. Oregon had a kind of a mini or junior day, but got a couple commitments out of it. ASU had an impressive group of guys. I mean, we could just start alphabetically. Let's start with Arizona State.
Let's start with ASU. They what they call it? They called it heat check.
Heat check, yes.
Yeah, that is incredible. That is incredible stuff.
Yeah,
I appreciate that they lean into like that sort of metric, right? In terms of they're trying to figure out, okay, where do we sit with you? And let's have fun with words and call it a heat check. We did see Kenny Dillingham, Hines Ward, Demetrius Martin, a few other coaches from ASU at the Centennial camp on Thursday last week, where Chaparral and Centennial both had kind of a dual camp, and they were out in full force. And that was, mere hours before they were going to be back on campus to try to host a lot of the recruits. And I think when you look at their visitor list, I know you had a really good rundown over at Sun Devil Source, our ASU site on the 24/7 Sports Network. And it was littered with prospects that I think Cal has a really good, legitimate shot with, or ASU.
Yeah. And I think what was important for ASU is that obviously they wanted to make an impression with those local prospects that came. They had Jake Hildebrand, Noah Roberts, the top 2 players in the state from Basha High School in the 2027 class. They had Roy Oliver, the elite playmaker who won just about every award for the high school player of the year in the state of Arizona, and Arizona State legacy, his brother Roman Oliver. But then they also have been dipping into Texas the last couple of years. Texas to Tempe, I think, has been the slogan. So they had, their quarterback commit in 2027 from Texas was there. They had a number of other players. They had guys from the Midwest there. Quentin Burrell, a top 247 receiver who Hines Ward is kind of honed in on. he was there. And so ASU did a really good job when they're going up against junior days at USC and UCLA, when they're going up against a junior day in the Bay Area, when they're going up against Oregon and Washington having smaller select groups. ASU had a pretty impressive turnout of guys, a lot of balloons. One thing we did see over the weekend, Blair, was a lot of balloons at these junior days. We saw a lot of those big, I don't even know what you call them, those big lit letters for
it's
whatever.
Kind of what you see at like a baby shower.
Yeah.
Or like
been a while since I've been to one.
Like a third birthday.
Yes.
It's kind of like a decoration, but it's also a photo opportunity. It's kind of like what you set up as a photo station at a wedding or something.
Pizza cakes, cookie cakes, tired, balloons, and big letters lit wired. But yeah, I think Arizona State really going into, there's a 7-on-7 tournament in Tempe, in the Phoenix area over the weekend. So they had a lot of guys that came in for visits that weren't going to the junior day, that just came in for an unofficial visit. One guy to keep an eye on too, he didn't go to junior day on Saturday, but he took an unofficial visit on Friday. That is very intriguing. It's Steele Harris. He's the number 2 player in the state of Montana, has an offer from Arizona State, but his brother Reed Harris was, I think, the number 14 overall player in the transfer portal, the former number 1 player in Montana who went to Boston College. Arizona State had 2 top 20 players out of the portal go to ASU, him and Omarion Miller, and now Steele Harris, the younger brother. ASU is very high on his list. He said after that visit that Arizona State is definitely at the top for him. So even with just the junior day visitors on Saturday, they had a good number of guys that were there on Friday and Sunday that had ASU offers. So Arizona State kind of using this beautiful weekend. It was 81 degrees. I got sunburn. It was fantastic. That's why I moved. Did I ever mention that? I moved because of the sun.
There were a few other players from Southern California that made it out to ASU that I think the Sun Devils are in a really good spot with, Huff, and that's Jaden Watt Green, the safety from Centennial. He told us that he's really high on Washington, Oklahoma, but ASU has been making him a huge priority. So he was out there, just mere hours after getting those coaches to come over to Centennial to watch him work out. Isala Isa Vailiava from St. John Bosco, the 4-star safety. I've liked Washington in that battle for a long time. I know Ohio State's involved. Michigan's involved now. Texas A&M's involved. But ASU, I think, made a nice push there for them. And they do have a history of being able to reel in some prospects from St. John Bosco that maybe people didn't really expect them to reel in. I think there's a lot of opportunity at ASU for some of these players, and I think they recognize that. I think Isala would be a good fit in that secondary or even at linebacker. I think he's a player that continues to show that he's going to be multi-positional, very versatile, physical, and a heady, smart player that has a lot of snaps under his belt. Tyson Johnson, 4-star wide receiver from Chaparral, also worked out in front of the coaches on Thursday and then was at a Tempe just a couple hours later, and I think he's another prospect to watch for that program. Who, remember, they already have gone out west and gone out into Southern California to get a commitment, and that's from Nico Bland, the 4-star receiver from Orange Lutheran. Jeremiah Williams is another one, defensive lineman from Tustin that I think the Sun Devils have been in a really good spot with. And don't sleep on ASU for Lincoln Mageo, the high upside offensive lineman from Oceanside. When you think about Coach Sanga Tuitele and kind of the connection that he has built with him, it's a program that has made him a huge priority since basically the beginning of his recruiting process. And Huff, you and I, going to camps, going to showcases, whenever we go out on the road and we see some players, maybe especially along the offensive line, you see guys that are nowhere near what they're going to be at the next level from a physical standpoint. There are some finished products, right? There are the 6'5", 325-pound guy that you're like, okay, he can step onto a college campus right now and probably play, but then you don't have much to dream on there from just an upside standpoint, right? Or maybe a projection, or it's kind of what he is already, right?
Yeah,
that's completely the opposite of what I think with Lincoln Mageo, because he's all of 6'4". He looks about 270, 275, and he's kind of rocked up. Like he would probably he could have, I don't know, like 6-pack abs if you wanted to at that size. I think he's going to continue to trend upward, and that's one of those players that you bet on. I think ASU made a nice push there for him as well. Do you want to continue to go alphabetic order? Let's go up to Berkeley and talk a little bit about Cal. They called theirs the Premier Day.
Yes.
So maybe a little bit different. I don't know what Premier Day means. Is it just Premier Recruits, or do you have any insight on what their name was?
I think they were just trying to kind of designate a more catchy name rather than Elite, since Elite seemed to be already using, or maybe Tosh Lupoi is channeling his inner soccer fan and, trying to play out. Remember, they made that switch back to Nike from, I think, Under Armour. Maybe they're channeling what some of those premium NFL, what do we call that? EPL? You're the soccer guy, not me. And being Premier League. Yeah. So, maybe he's channeling his inner World Cup. It's 2026. I was listening to a podcast today, Blair, and did you know the Bay Area, that Levi's Stadium is the only stadium in world history to host a Super Bowl and a World Cup game in the same year? So maybe because the Super Bowl's in the Bay this coming weekend, but the World Cup's coming there, Bay Area native Tosh Lupoi was channeling into his soccer roots.
Yeah, no, I dig it. It doesn't get more premier than Honor Fa'alave Johnson, the number one player in the state of California, the number one ranked safety. I think would have a case to be a 5-star running back as well if you wanted to designate him as that. A top tier athlete. I think we saw how viral he went running. What was it, the 22.7 on the GPS, tracking his miles per hour. Just an electric, physical, big time burst type of athlete that can do a lot of different things on the football field. And, I wrote about it over the weekend, Huff, in kind of that inside look at what Tosh and Cal is trying to do with Honor. And that's to sell him on being a multi-positional star. Like this has the potential to have Heisman Trophy types of ramifications if he were to end up going to Cal, because he's got not only the production as an offensive player, but the significance of what he can do in the secondary, playing nickel, playing safety. He could play some corner. You've seen him match up at corner and do very, very well back at the Polynesian Bowl Combine in Vegas. I mean, a player that can do it all. And I think that's what Cal is pitching to him, is like, hey, come here and you can do whatever you want. And we're going to give you essentially a blank canvas for you to be able to paint your picture of what you want your college career to be. And I think they knocked it out of the park. Maybe a dark horse or a sleeper or a program that you could consider maybe not even having a realistic shot, considering some of the schools that are in the picture for him, USC and Oregon and Alabama and Texas and a few others nationally, Notre Dame, Ohio State. You can name all the blue bloods you want to name. This is a player that I think Cal is going to have a really good shot with, considering what they just showed him in Berkeley this past weekend.
We talk about, too, how Tosh Lupoi really wants to emphasize Northern California and emphasize the Bay Area and Sacramento. But what was probably the most impressive was the group from Arizona that came up to Berkeley. You had Jalen Easterling Flores, who's a top 5 player in the state in 2028, as we mentioned, Jelani George, and then Jai Jones, who's a 2027 top 10 player. He was up there as well. But go back to Northern California. You had Malachi Taufu, who, interestingly enough, just announced his first official visit set up to Penn State in the month of June. But Malachi from nearby Sarah High School was in Berkeley this week. And then you also had Josh Booney, who, we got a chance to see. I got a chance to see him in October up at Cardinal Newman in Santa Rosa, originally from Australia. He was at Cardinal Newman, but didn't get eligible this last season. Saw him at the Warriors for Youth Camp last month. Cal ended up offering him, so he's a Bay Area guy now, kind of by trade, but a very intriguing player. And then Troy Bowens, who at one point had Oregon in the lead, partly because of Tosh Lupoi. Then Washington kind of moved up because he had gotten an offer from then Cal assistant DPP Marcus Griffin, who went to Washington. Now Lupoi comes back to Cal. And Troy Bowens, who's the number 1 defensive player in Northern California in 2027, out of Sutter, California, now has the Bears right there at the very top of this list. So it's very methodical. We're seeing a big emphasis and very deliberate approach by Tosh, by Marshall Charrington, and that staff in kind of targeting some hotspot areas where Cal has had some success, whether that is the Bay Area, whether that's been Sacramento. Obviously, look at their first commitment in this class, Giovanni Hodge out of Sacramento. But Cal's had a nice little run in Arizona. Obviously, they've also hit Hawaii pretty hard, and we saw a number of players get offers from Cal in the spring and in the fall during the season, but Cal having a presence there. But you're definitely seeing a renewed vigor and enthusiasm by Cal, and that's largely because that's how Tosh Lupoi operates, with a lot of energy and vigor when he recruits.
Yeah, I don't know if we ever questioned whether or not Tosh was going to be able to recruit at Cal, and considering what we saw this month of January and all the travels that he made, and while juggling, right, like Oregon's place in the college football playoff, and kind of the renewed interest from a lot of players, and thinking that Cal is a realistic destination. Star-studded list. Huff, DeVay Williams was up there instead of going to the USC Trojan Olympics. He traveled up to the Bay Area, and he's one of the top corners in the country. Evan Mack was up there, another high upside corner, 4-star, top 24/7 player. Ali Feleti Tui Halamaka was up there from Oaks Christian, big time defensive lineman, top 100 player in the country. Go down the list. Miles Shermer, his brother Kingston's already on campus as a Cal Bear. Charles Davis, big time tight end. Caden Jones, quarterback from Queen Lutheran. Jaden Jefferson, the quarterback at Centennial, was up there after landing an offer recently. And then a bevy of younger up and coming underclassmen. Pole Moala, who's one of the best safeties in America, regardless of class. Elisha Muller from Servite, another top 100 player in 2028. Koa Malaulu, who is a quarterback at St. John Bosco and has an offer from the Bears. And I saw him Sunday at the Pylon LA, and he had just kind of came back from Berkeley, and he said he loved it, and that's going to be a program to monitor for him moving forward. Micah Hanna, corner from Simi Valley, who was up there and picked up an offer from the Bears. So up and down the list, you look at what they did this weekend. I think if you're a Cal Bear fan, you should be super excited about their ability to acquire talent moving forward, because they're going to attract players. And based on all the feedback we got and all the input that we got about visitors that were up there, they sensed a renewed energy, and they sensed kind of a surprising atmosphere, something that is now tangible with Tosh and with that front office. And you mentioned Marshall Sherrington and his vigor and his energy levels to try to land some top players. I think very interested to see, because I think they have a shot to be a sleeping giant in the ACC. Huff. I do. I mean, they have everything in kind of lined up, right? They have the franchise quarterback. They're able to recruit defensive talent. I think their defense is going to be really good. And, you surround Jaron Keave Sanga-Polutele with some playmakers, and I don't know, man, like a potential Heisman hopeful in honor of Fa'alave Johnson down the road. Like that's going to be a team to really monitor in the ACC. Let's move on to Oregon now, right? If we're going alphabetic, I think O becomes before the U's. The Ducks, kind of a second mini junior day. I don't know if they've had a heat check or a premiere day, but they have now had back-to-back weekends where they attracted some big-time talent, and I think it was smart for them to be able to split things up and really focus on some of the visitors that were there the weekend before, and then this past weekend, including Huff, Kasai Curry, a top 25 player from Southern California, big-time defensive lineman, comes from Sierra Canyon, and we know the history of Oregon and Sierra Canyon. And I think I joked last week that Kasai Curry would probably want to stay away from the pool. Didn't make a splash, didn't jump into the pool with Dan Lanning like Richard Wesley did last year, but a really good visit for him as well. And I think the Ducks are sitting in a good spot there as they battle some of these SEC schools. Who else had you kind of set your sights on that made it up to Eugene this past weekend?
Yeah, Avery Michael back up there and ended up committing to the Ducks. Obviously, that was a big pickup for Oregon. He has been one of the fastest rising players out west in the 2027 class. We got a chance to see him last spring at the Under Armour camp in Southern California. A little bit raw, a little bit of a guy that, he looked the part, but, there wasn't a whole lot there at that point. I think he had a couple of FCS offers, and then he's blown up. UCLA, USC, Washington, Oregon, Michigan offered him. His recruitment really ascended to another level. And he had just named a top 6 when he had actually committed to Oregon. So that was a big one there. They weren't done on the offensive line, too. Also getting Drew Fielder from Servite High School. If you're a fan of Servite football, some of the toughest players that we've covered over the last 20 years are Servite Friars, whether it's Tatori McMillan, Noah Fafita, Mason Graham, Cleveland Brown star Mason Graham, of course, Matt Khalil. And so with one thing with Servite guys, you're going to get a guy that's tough, that's going to be physical, that's part of that, Servite credo. So a couple of very nice pickups for Oregon along the offensive line, a couple of nice pieces for A'lique Terry to really be able to develop over these next couple of years.
And I don't know. I think you could clump in Trent McDuffie, Huff, into that same. I mean, I know he finished his career at St. John Bosco, but
didn't Amon-Ra start out as a freshman at Servite before he went to Mater Dei?
He did because Osiris was there as well, and then they moved over when Equanimous shifted over, or when he graduated. They were both there, and they ended up going to Mater Dei. I don't know if we lost you, Huff, or your camera. Can you still hear us?
I'm still here. I have to go to my other computer to go break a top 10 real quick.
Oh, okay. Well, then you're giving us some actual insight here live and in person.
We'll break it down in like 30 seconds.
All right. What are we going here? We're going on top 10. Is that for DeJon Yarborough?
DeJon Yarborough, just
okay.
Top 10.
So offensive lineman from Basha. So stay locked into all the social media channels because Huff's about to break a new top 10 for big time offensive linemen from the state of Arizona. So, and you mentioned Drew Fielder committing. I think that's another significant one because I think it's the new blueprint for acquiring talent along the offensive line, Huff. Like you supplement and you add some impact, day one type of players through the portal, right? If you need a big time offensive tackle, if you need to replace your center or a guard or whatever it may be, you go and get a ready-made player in the portal. But I think what you can do in the high school ranks now, and I think it's brilliant what Oregon's doing, and I mentioned this earlier with Lincoln Mageo, kind of having that baby deer vibe to him where he's still just scratching the surface of what he's going to be. I think these two fit that to a T completely. Avery Michael, when you see, photos of him and you kind of see what he looks like in person, that in 4 years he's going to be completely different, and it's all a projection. The same thing could be said about Drew Fielder, who was playing tight end, about 15, 16 months ago. I showed up to a spring practice last year at Servite, and it was just one of his first practices that he had ever done playing offensive line. So I think they're getting in on some high upside projectable players that you can kind of stash away, develop. And once they're ready, then you throw them out there and say, okay, what do you have? What can you show us? And if it doesn't work out, then you go back to the drawing board via the portal. I think that's just more of like what you're going to be able to do. I think what's also really noteworthy, Huff, is them being able to lock in commitments, because they have the power to do so now, Huff. Like they are able to, in a way, kind of force the hand of some of these players, right? You mentioned that Avery Michael had just named the top 6. Drew Fielder told us that he didn't really expect to commit on the visit. But I'm sure these coaches are pitching commitments and they're selling the commitments and they're saying, hey, we need you now or we're going to move on. And, to an extent, it's a brilliant strategy.
And, just going back to development, I mean, Oregon had, and in no way am I comparing Avery Michael and Drew Fielder to Josh Connolly, but, Josh Connolly was the number 1 tackle when he came out, but he was about 255 pounds when he got to Oregon. Ultimately ended up an All-American, a first-round draft pick, started as a rookie this year for the Washington Commanders. And, Adrian Clem signed him, but he didn't start until A'lique Terry got there. And so he didn't start as a true freshman. And you think about it, like you said, Blair, with linemen, you want to be able to develop them for a couple of years. You would prefer not to have to throw a true freshman lineman if you can. And Oregon's done a good job recruiting out of the portal. They've been able to get offensive tackles, whether it was Isaiah World a year ago. they've been able to get those guys out of the portal and put the more experienced guys on the field and then develop some of those younger guys like a Poncho, like a Dave Yulee, who was in year 4, and then be able to turn them loose. So if you're looking at a Fielder and a Michael right now, and you look at those pictures, don't think about him right now this way. Think about him in 2028, 29, and you look at Elite Terry's track record. It's been pretty phenomenal. I think Oregon won the Joe Moore Award in 2024. They were one of the top 3 finalists for it in 2025. So there's a nice little track record there. And if you are a Michael and a Fielder and you're not expecting to come in and play right away, that's a good program to go in, be developed.
Yeah. So a few other visitors for the Ducks that were of significance. Danny Lang, who, I wrote last week, it really looks like a USC versus Oregon battle, and the Ducks continue to chip away there to land the Southern California talent. You got Miles Baker. I really like the Ducks for that 4-star safety from Sierra Canyon. He went out to LSU recently. There's a few other schools like A&M and Michigan, and Washington to an extent is also involved. Montana Toilolo from Mater Dei was up there. You got to consider the Ducks to be the favorite for him as well. It was a really good group. And I think what was smart of them, and I mentioned this off the top, is that they were able to split it into kind of 2 weekends, and they could really focus on some of these players, because remember, they haven't been able to recruit to the extent that some of the other programs got a chance to recruit, because they were busy with the college football playoffs. So, now with these 2 weekends, they're able to split things up and really get their ducks in a row, per se, if you want to call it that.
Nice.
Heading into this dead period and obviously ahead of the March 2nd quiet period. Do want to remind our listeners, the podcast were brought to you by the Avery Huffman DIPG Foundation. We are working to end the deadliest form of childhood brain cancer. Huff, where can they find more information on the foundation?
Yeah, go to our social media channels at Avery Strong DIPG on Instagram, on Twitter, X, on Facebook, or go to our website, averystrongdipg.org.
Huff, let's move on to UCLA. They also had a Junior Day event, and probably the first big recruiting event, we could call it, in the Bob Chesney era. A ton of prospects made it through, and it netted them a commitment as well. Kiko Farinas, Michael is his government name, if we want to call him that. Big time receiver. I mean, nearly 1,200 receiving yards as a junior this past season at Chaparral. A really electric slot receiver that can get open underneath and kind of blow the top off of a secondary, and is a threat whenever he gets the ball in his hands, just because of his sheer elusiveness and his foot speed. I think every program and I mean, you could even say every NFL team now has kind of that shifty slot receiver. Has become a specialist role, and I think he would fill it to a T in that Bob Chesney offense.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was talking to a Power 4 staffer in the last couple of weeks, and they even said by name, with Kiko, like, yeah, Eli Wood, Tyson Johnson are getting all the attention at Chaparral, but don't sleep on Kiko. And then you were at that showcase last Thursday where it sounded like he was just putting in work, gets the offer on Saturday, commits on Monday. So kind of a wild 96 hours for him. But, it's also one of those that maybe UCLA is not going to get those top tier guys. They've offered both of those players as well. And maybe they needed to start with those guys who's that high 88, that guy that they can develop, that maybe isn't getting a lot of that attention that maybe some of his teammates were. But it also doesn't hurt to get a trusty sidekick for the quarterback that they're targeting. And I think, like you said, you were the first one that was the first offer that Bob Chesney's staff made to a 2027 quarterback was to Dane Weber. So they got him on campus, but got his guy at receiver. We saw that happen with UCLA a couple of years ago when they got, at the time, Mad Amaliava and Jace Brown. So sometimes you want to bring that battery together. And hey, I think UCLA would not be opposed if they can get their quarterback and all of his receivers.
Yeah, it is going to be a challenge, I think, for UCLA to land Dane Weber. And, he's got a multitude of options. Oregon's a school that he's really high on, Cincinnati, Purdue. He's going to visit Michigan in March as well. So he's got a ton of options and a ton of different possibilities. But I do think that UCLA kind of presented him in a way, a really enticing pitch, which is, hey, like, stay closer to home. You can play for a program that is just kind of starting from the ground and is now building through you. And I think what was really striking and hearing a lot of the recruits, not only Dane, talk about this, was just how charismatic and how personable and just how easy it was to connect with Bob Chesney and that entire staff. And you gotta, I think, gotta give them a lot of credit as well, because it's one thing to start building and start kind of putting together a junior day and get some recruits on campus. But I think it's another thing entirely to really capitalize on the moment, right? And capitalize on being able to pitch this new vision or pitch this program. And I think, they could have easily not really done any of that. We saw it with Deshaun Foster to an extent. We saw it obviously with Chip Kelly in the tenure before that. And I think UCLA was kind of just like, like, we'll figure it out, right? We'll go in the portal and we'll get some guys eventually. And I think 40 plus commitments in the portal for UCLA. And now I think they're emphasizing high schools, knowing that this is a new staff with kind of a new vibe. But they were maybe one of the most active that we saw out west throughout the month of January, kind of hitting the road hard, hitting schools, and making sure that prospects now have at least given them an opportunity to go out there and watch, right? We saw Gavin Williams, who didn't have UCLA in his top 5, but he goes out there for junior day. He could have easily been at USC or gone up to ASU or Cal or Oregon or wherever else. Marcus Fakatau also, right? The elite defensive lineman who I don't think anyone's expecting him to land at UCLA, but for him to even go out there and cut his USC visit short by going across town and kind of hearing out what the Bruins have to say. I mean, that's just, I think those are signs and those are little signals that if you're a UCLA fan, you have to kind of look at and say, okay, these are the coaches that are trying at least to change up the formula to land a different type of recruit, because Kiko has, I think, a really specific role in an offense. He's going to be able to fill that to a T, but I think they're casting a wider net now than we saw with other staffs.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that, is showing a pulse in Westwood, is that they're actually trying. They're getting out on the road. They're being visible. I mean, how many times did we see during the Chip Kelly era, he would go to a school that was relevant, a high school that was relevant in 1993, back when I played. And instead of going to the Modern Days and the Boscos and the Centennials, he was going to some random school that didn't have a player that was even on the radar, let alone had already transferred to some other Trinity League school. And he with Deshaun Foster, you didn't see quite the vigor and the enthusiasm. Now, in his defense, he got hired in February, so literally only had one January that he could hit on the road. But, this staff coming from the playoff, hitting the portal hard as they did, and then hitting the road, and then being able to get, and again, what I think was the most intriguing about UCLA's junior day was not just the local kids that they got, but the national names that they were able to get. Again, it didn't hurt that there was an event, a 7-on-7 tournament in the Southland. It didn't hurt that there was a major 5-on-5 in the Southland, but they brought in a guy like Zylan Little from Florida. They had a couple of players from St. Francis Academy in Baltimore that ended up getting offers, as well as the local kids. So you're seeing Bob Chesney and that staff that has spent time in the Atlantic part of the country, in the Northeast, kind of tap back into that region. And you're seeing some of the coaches that had ties down to the Southeast try and hit there, but then you're also seeing that emphasis and that focus in the West and in Southern California. And it's almost like, as somebody who's covered recruiting for 23 years, tomorrow will be the 23rd signing day, that our 23rd class wrapping up. It's been at least a decade since you've actually seen some effort and some relevance when it comes to UCLA recruiting. Now it's a matter of, okay, there's been some activity. Now we got to move to that achievement stage.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too that they, in a way, kind of centered it around his introduction to the fans inside Pauley Pavilion. And I don't know if it was halftime or a media timeout, or at some point he goes out on the court and, he kind of riles up the fan base, telling them that he wants to win a Big Ten championship and that the future is now. And, hearing recruits talk about what it was like to be there with him. I think it's an optimistic situation for a lot of players. And I think now for that program to see kind of what they're going to be able to do in the Big Ten with a new staff. Across town, Huff, at USC, they had their annual Trojan Olympics. And I think that's super unique. Not only are we in an Olympic city, they're in an Olympic stadium. And it's not a heat check. It's not a premiere day, but they do have that Olympic spirit in a sense where they have competitions, including a steak grilling competition. How are you around the grill?
I'm a fantastic around the grill. I'm a Blackstone owner, Blair. So we're in that time of year.
What does that mean? If you're a Blackstone owner, does that mean you have now like reached a different echelon of mastery?
You have, or you really are impatient, and so this will grill it a lot faster. But I would like to put myself in those Olympics. I think I got some ability to grill and multiple different things that I could put on the grill: chicken, steak, seafood, burgers, you name it. I'm good, but Blair, it's a young generation. I don't know if that they have the patience to, and plus they eat a lot healthier. So I would love to have seen the grilling results from this young generation, when they aren't able to DoorDash it and Uber Eats it.
I saw Jalen Hill, 4-star corner, who plays for Hellstar at the Pylon 7-on-7 in LA, and on Sunday, right? So this was a full day before, or a full day after his grilling experience inside the Coliseum. And, he said he had a blast. It was fun. It was kind of cool to connect with some of these guys and team up and try to have a better grilling experience than the guys next to him. Some people burning them, maybe some people undercooking their steaks. But it's kind of those moments, and we saw it last year, how much it paid off for USC when you get together as a group and you start to bond with some of these guys that could potentially be your future teammates, could potentially recruit with you or commit with you to that program. So I think them leaning into that sort of vibe and that sort of event is really significant. Now, that visitor list did take a hit. We didn't see Honor Falave Johnson there. He went up to Cal instead. Duvet Williams, another player that USC has kind of been trending with for a long time. He heads up to Cal as well. A few others that weren't able to show up entirely or maybe skipped out, midway through. But I think all in all, you should feel really good about kind of what they did as well, because this is going to be a smaller class. It's not going to be in the 30-plus range. It's going to be maybe half of that in this cycle. So they can be a little bit more selective, and they can be a little bit more patient and maybe not, in a way, kind of get some early commitments. And, they, for the most part, had a who's who of targets on campus. Quentin Hale was there. I mentioned Jalen Hill, Marcus Fakatau made it over. Lucas Roa, the big time offensive lineman from Olu, was there. Eli Woodard, who USC is doing really well with, and the teammate of Kiko Farinas over at Chaparral, was also there. So, I think a really good list. Eric McFarland, another elite receiver who made it on campus. I think, USC is kind of setting the table for, I think, what's going to be a really impressive spring and I'm expecting a run of commitments here really, really early, because when you do have a smaller class, it starts to create a demand and supply indifference, or a difference in between, the kind of the spots and how many you're able to actually take. And, I think recruits are going to start to realize that.
I want to touch on something when we're done talking about USC too, just about kind of what you were mentioning about the building the bond. Does that matter anymore too in a portal era? And, I think about it, and what made me think about it, there was a couple things. I was talking to a recruit who was at Cal, and they mentioned talking to Michael Hutchings, and Michael Hutchings is the new defense coordinator in Berkeley. But what Michael Hutchings also was known for is he was a commit to USC in the 2013 class that at one point was the number one class in the country. I know, you and I have talked about that class historically. You went out to go see USC commit Jalen Ramsey. Or actually, you went out to go see another USC commit, and Jalen Ramsey was out visiting.
It was Chris Hawkins against Sua Cravens out in Murrieta. It was on Black Friday, and I remember that specifically because I stopped at the outlets in Lake Elsinore or out there somewhere. I stopped to grab lunch, and I remember how crazy it was. And I was like, why did I stop at a mall on Black Friday? So yeah, but then I remember, and then Jalen Ramsey, who played his high school ball in Tennessee, was committed to USC at the time, and he flew across the country to come watch two guys that he was going to potentially play with at the next level play a playoff game in November. I mean, that was different. That was different times, like different times.
It was. And the reason I bring that up is, I remember Hutch being such a key part of keeping that class together that had a lot of promise to be a very good class, but they were undergoing sanctions at the time. And you remember USC headed into that season as the number one team in the country, ultimately ended up 7-6. And then a year later, Lane Kiffin was fired. But, I was listening to a podcast this week, and they were talking to a player who just graduated in 2025. And he was talking about how, when he was coming in as freshman, those were like his best friends. But then by the time he got to his 6th year, and he was a COVID guy who played an extra year, he said, half my class was gone. And nowadays, those guys you come in with, you're not there with them. The class that you come in with as freshmen, by your sophomore year, it's starting to look different. By your junior year, it's looking really different. And if you're still there by your senior year and even beyond, it looks like a ghost town. And so, we see it on social media every year. You see it with fan bases. You see it with schools that say, hey, this is our big class, our hashtag this. But, does that even matter anymore? And it makes you wonder, too, is another player that's coming in that maybe higher ranked, is he a threat, not just on the field? Remember, we were in an era where it wasn't super uncommon to see 2 quarterbacks going into one class. You knew that one was going to go in the portal before. Actually, there wasn't such thing as a portal. You knew one would transfer if he fell behind the other on the depth chart. But now it's like, is that person a threat to what that revenue sharing is? So, there's that part of me that wonders. And Brian Doan for 24/7 Sports had a really good article that he published today, where he talked about how the college football transfer portal is shaping their decisions. But it also makes you wonder are we seeing the end of an era where it mattered who you went to school with, who was a part of your recruiting class? And I don't know if it's just me, Blair. I've noticed this a little bit more in the last year or two. When you ask a guy that's committed, hey, who have you really built a good relationship with in your recruiting class as a commit? Oh, we don't really talk to the class as much. Or I don't really know those guys as much. 5 years ago, you would talk about, oh man, our group chat is popping. Now, 5 years later, I don't really know those guys a whole lot. Is that becoming something that's more prevalent? Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just the guys that I've asked. But are we starting to see the end of the super era in recruiting? Now, USC would be the first one to say no, because how many of those guys played together, whether it was in 7-on-7, they trained together. They were all high school teammates. A number of modern day players were in that class. But is that going to be the exception to the rule moving forward, or is that going to be the rule? Something to ponder as we head into this dead period in February.
Existential Huff is one of my favorite Huffs. When you think about philosophy, and you're coming up with some questions that I'm like, okay, that's a deep think, like 4-hour podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You threw out the word pelotas earlier, which is nice as well. I mean, you've been on one today. Now you have me like questioning whether or not I need to get a Blackstone. Like you brought the goods today, Huff. So
it's just
you were going to say.
Well, I was just going to say, every once in a while, you finally realize, like, hey, what? There's some issues to touch on. There's some words to use. There's some Spanglish to throw in there. And then there's some skills to show off that you have to tout every once in a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way we started this podcast talking about, the good old days of yesteryear, where we would go to, what was it, like 4 a.m. on Starbucks whenever they would open? And
absolutely,
because we'd have to be ready for those 7 o'clock Eastern time. Fax machines started to fire up, and just covering signing day. By the way, I just remembered Michael Hutchings. I also did see in high school, and it was a part of a 3-stop, maybe 15-hour situation where I flew into Sacramento, went up to see Eddie Vanderdoes in a town called Placer, on the way towards like Reno, up in the mountains, like an old gold mining town. Then I drove and I raced down to Stockton to go see Justin Davis. Remember, the big time running back?
Yep. In high school.
And then the next morning, first thing in the morning, I was at De La Salle in Concord to see Michael Hutchings back in the day. I mean, that's way back in the day. So talk about nostalgia. Football. Talk about nostalgia, Huff. Those were different times. Anything else that we want to add on USC before we kind of switch gears and talk about some other commitments from the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you see with USC is that they're very intentional in who they're approaching. Obviously, with Chad Bowden coming in the 2024 or at the end of the 2024 season, heading into 2025, and then allowing them to bring out that number one recruiting class. What was interesting too, and I think on the heels of Junior Day is, with the exception of Stanford and Cal, where you've got the general managers who are the main faces of those programs. I mean, obviously, Tosh Lupoi, Tavita Pritchard, the new head coaches respectively at their alma maters, but their general managers are kind of the faces of those programs, with Ron Rivera at Cal, Andrew Luck at Stanford. But I thought it was fascinating that it wasn't just Lincoln Riley who met with the media this week, but that Chad Bowden did as well. That should tell you the gravitas in which Lincoln Riley has allowed him to have as the primary recruiting guy at USC, as their general manager, bringing him over from Notre Dame. And I think that when he got there in the winter of 2025, he knew that USC had some face saving to do when it came to recruiting. And they responded very loudly and very successfully with the number one class. Now, I think that the buzz is back with USC recruiting, with the West Coast kids specifically. Partially it was because Riley was focusing so much on Georgia guys, Southern guys, Texas guys, and not facing those Southern California players with that same energy. Chad Bowden said, no, this is how we need to do it. And it worked magnificently. And we go back to that 2013 class at USC that we've been talking about. They had limited scholarships in that time because of the NCAA sanctions. They still had the number one class before the bottom kind of fell out. And so you and I both have worked in an era where USC having the number one class was never like, oh my gosh, USC's back. It was, okay, so this is another recruiting class. USC is got a top 3 to 5 class. I think coming off the heels of a big class in 2026, USC is going to be a little bit more intentional and specific in who they're targeting in 2027. But make no mistake, they're not going to be waning when it comes to that effort and energy and that focus on Southern California kids.
Little breaking news here. You broke some earlier. I don't really have anything prepared, but I just got a message. Speaking of USC, Huff, Eli Woodard is going to be committing at his school February 10th. It sounds like it's going to be USC versus Oregon versus Michigan versus Missouri. So big time wide receiver. We don't have him as a 3-star in our rankings. I think he's a 4-star personally. That would be myself ranking, because he's incredible as a route runner, maybe the best route runner I've seen in this 2027 class. Strong hands, forceful, every movement has a purpose. He sets up defenders really well, and then he's super productive. I think 16-17 touchdowns as a junior this past season, and he was at the Trojan Olympics, and I think USC is in a really good spot there for Eli Woodard. Let's dive into some other commitments, Huff. We had Washington. I think, was it their first commitment of the class?
No, it's their first commitment of the calendar year, but they did get 2 in-state commitments from Maurice Williams and Braylon Pope, both who had a chance to see this weekend at the Red Zone 7-on-7 tournament. But this was, I want to say, this might be their first out-of-state commitment in the 2027 class. We are still stuck on 2026 on the website. We haven't switched over to 2027. So I can't tell you for sure if this is their first out-of-state commitment in 2027 until our page refreshes. But Titus Osterman, who was the number one play, I'm an idiot. They got 2 commitments in the last week.
Yeah, Zarek Sidney is the one that I was referencing.
Yeah, it was such a technical glitch that we were dealing with during his announcement that I've kind of removed that one from my memory. But yes, Zarek Sidney. What was interesting about him is that he got his first offer as an 8th grader from Arizona, from Kevin Cummings, who's now the receivers coach at Washington. And we've seen, we talked about on this show in December, we were wrapping up signing day. Kevin Cummings is low-key turning into one of the best recruiters in the country. Not just one of the best receiver recruiters, but you look at what he did down the stretch in 2026, in the class of 2026, flipping Jordan Clay. You look at who he was able to bring into some of those classes before, and now he's got the top receiver in Washington committed in Braylon Pope. He's got the top receiver in Arizona committed in Zarek Sidney. So Kevin Cummings continuing to flourish there as a receivers coach, but also as a recruiter. Nice pickup for them. And then Titus Osterman, who's the number one player in the state of Idaho in 2027 out of Kimberly, Idaho. He also committed to the Huskies this weekend. He'd been leaning there heavily for quite some time. So, Washington getting a couple of nice pickups there. But I really like the Braylon Pope and Zarek Sidney. You mentioned that Eli Woodard is a guy that, could be a 4-star. Braylon Pope is a 4-star in the composite. I believe he might even be the top ranked player in the state per the composite, a high 3-star on 24/7 Sports, but part of 2 state champion teams at Summit the last couple of years. And now you add in Zarek Sidney, who was part of a state championship team as a sophomore, part of a loaded roster as well. Nice little start for the Huskies. And then adding Titus Osterman is a nice little bonus there.
Yeah, so from a former Pac-12 school to a couple other current Pac-12 schools, Fresno State got a commitment, and then late on Monday night, San Diego State also picked up a commitment. What do you got on both of those situations?
Yeah, so Fresno State getting Justin Ortiz, a kid that we got to see last winter or last spring, I guess. And we mentioned Avery Michael, where we saw him. Well, Justin Ortiz, I think, outside of Benjamin Lothar, Justin Ortiz, I think, had the biggest, was the tallest offensive lineman at the Under Armour camp in Southern California. We'd seen him at the Polynesian Bowl. And Ortiz got an offer from Fresno State. R. Jackson Moore wrote that his family's had season tickets there for years, and now he's getting to stay at the school he grew up watching at Fresno State. I think that the tweet I saw that was cool. We always like to wax poetic about some of the tweets. We talked about it last week with Sam Nagata, but his mom tweeted saying, "We're going to keep our seats, but you're going to lose your seat because you're going to be on the field." I mean, that's super cool when you get to see the school that you've grown up rooting for, that opportunity to go playing for them. So he's going to Fresno State. But then Naz Eason out of Higley High School in Gilbert was in San Diego this weekend. There was a good contingent of players from Arizona that were down in San Diego this weekend. He, Aiden Whitaker, Luke Farrell, a quarterback out of Corona del Sol and Tempe, were all down there. But Naz Eason, who had a number of Power 4 offers, decided after going to San Diego State in the fall, he was in Montezuma Mesa the same time you were, Blair. He was there for that memorable Cal game for San Diego State, saw that defense shut out Cal, and decided after the visit this weekend he wanted to be a part of that defense at San Diego State. So he made that commitment late on Monday night. So a couple of very nice pickups for Fresno State and San Diego State, as they, their football teams are now Pac-12 members. I know that we won't see them in Pac-12 patches until the fall. But on the same day that the Pac-12 media deals, the Mountain West media deals have been announced, San Diego State and Fresno State that have been mainstays in the Mountain West, they're headed to the Pac-12, and they've got a couple of talented players joining them when they get there after a year.
On signing day, and you usually do this, but on this signing day, I was able to really dive into Pac-12 recruiting classes with our guy, Mike Yam. And I don't know, like for whatever reason, that really got me excited about Pac-12 football. For as funny as kind of it had been to see, just a home and home between Wazoo and Oregon State, it's going to be really cool to kind of see the new look of the conference, right? And to kind of get excited about, some of these commitments now too, from a recruiting standpoint, because these are players that for the most part would be power conference level type of prospects and recruits that are now being kind of forced down a level, right, of into a different league because of the prevalence of the portal and what that's done for roster spots in the other conferences, whether that's the Big Ten or the SEC or the SC or the ACC or Big 12. I think now we're going to see maybe an elevated level of play from some of these schools. San Diego State was really impressive this past year. You think about, Colorado State and what they're doing on the recruiting trail and kind of the re-energized program as well under Jim Mora. Boise kind of jumping in there and trying to be, in a way, kind of the Boise that we've known to be at the Group of 5 level. I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm super intrigued. And I think now whenever a player commits to one of these Pac-12 schools, I think, it kind of gets the juices flowing a little bit more about the potential for what that conference could look like on the football field.
Yeah, and I think that, instantly there's been a lot of talk about how Pac-12 basketball is going to be upgraded largely because of the addition of a Gonzaga. But remember, San Diego State was in the national championship game just 3 years ago. Utah State, Colorado State have been in the tournament the last couple of years. So basketball is going to be good, but the resurgence of football, in a time where, yes, there's been a lot of opinions based on the fact that we had 2 G5 schools made the playoffs this last year. One acquitted themselves decently. The other one didn't really, acquit themselves. And then both those schools lost their head coaches. 2 Power 4 schools. We also saw Boise State, who's going to the Pac-12, had a playoff bye 2 years ago. So at a time where, the G5 is maybe under the microscope a little bit, you're now going to see the Pac-12 become what I think will be the best G5 conference and should be a perennial contender for a playoff spot. And it's been strengthened that much more because of Boise State, because of the addition of a San Diego State and a Fresno State and a Utah State. And don't forget that known Pacific state of Texas State also joining the Pac-12. But it's going to be great. And, not to say anything about the Mountain West, obviously with UNLV staying there, UNLV has been right on the cusp. I think it's been 3 years in a row. They've been in the Mountain West championship game. They may be getting to finally crack the glass ceiling because they'll no longer have to play Boise State in the Mountain West championship. But, it is, as 2 guys that grew up watching I grew up watching the Pac-10. You went to school when it was still the Pac-10, and then we saw it expand to the Pac-12, to the Pac-2, to now the Pac-12 with only 9 schools. But, you get used to seeing the Dolphins jumping up and down, or I don't know if they're dolphins or whales, that were part of the Pacific Life commercials. And that's when you knew you were watching Pac-12 sports. And, it's good to see it back. And you're seeing some schools that are hungry to kind of prove that the Pac-12 didn't really go anywhere, just took a little bit of a temporary break.
Yeah, it's I used to go to all the Pac-12 and Pac-10 media days, and I have like pens and little notepads and things
Flash
that
drive.
like are, but I still have some of them that are unused. And I think a couple of years ago I broke out a Pac-10 pen, and I was using it somewhere, and someone's like, "Why are you using that? Like that's a relic that should be locked away somewhere. You're throwing money away by draining the ink from this pen." So yeah, I'm excited. I think it's going to be good. And I think it's now elevated the interest also in recruiting for some of these programs. So yeah, it's going to be all good. And we're all going to be grilling on our Blackstones watching some Pac-12 football. Huff, anything else before we go? I know we've got Battle Vegas this weekend out in Sin City. Any quick little thoughts before we depart?
Yeah, we're coming up to Battle Weekend. Sadly, there is no more Huddle Brewing for us to go and enjoy ourselves some Huddle on a Friday night, and still find every time that we would tweet that guys didn't get it and would bombard us with their Huddle. But I think we will be able to find a backup plan. And, a lot of good teams coming in from all over the country, a lot of top talent. It's a bummer for UNLV that the entire month of February is dead, because there was once a time when you had major 7-on-7 events in Vegas that UNLV would have an upgraded group coming onto campus to visit. But we'll get to see a lot of major national guys at that event. I know you've got the Elite 11 and the opening regional coming up in late February in Los Angeles. You get into March, you got the Under Armour camp in Phoenix. And, Blair, we're fully tomorrow, the 2026 class. The book is shut. The chapter is closed. We move on to 2027. And, we both been in events these last couple of weeks, but 2026, your time is coming to a close. 2027, 2028, you guys are fully on the clock.
Some would say the pelota's in their court, right? So that's what someone would say.
Nice.
So for Brandon Huffman, I am Blair Angulo. Thank you so much for tuning in and for listening to this edition of the West of the Rest podcast. Enjoy the Super Bowl, because remember, football is going to be gone and you're going to be thirsting for it until we get it again in August. Thanks so much.
Go Patriots.